PutridMeat reporting. This community metagame idea is brought to you by St. Ides High Gravity Malt Liquor. Rocks you like a hurricane. First, I'd like to thank SOE for working with the community in order to help shape the direction of Planetside. It's a commendable approach, and I hope it remains as a lasting trend going forward. Now, to the putrid meat of the matter. I've made many a comment in several threads about what can be done to implement a working metagame, and one key aspect has held my interest ever since beta: resource management. Before I really get into the idea, I have in mind perhaps a little background into the current resource system and why I think it is currently impotent. So currently you have three resource types. You have aerospace resources in green that you use to purchase scythes, galaxies, and other winged thingamajigs at the corresponding terminal. You have infantry resources in yellow that you spend on fun toys like grenades, mines, mech suits, and the like. And then you have mechanized resources in red that buy your tanks, sunders, and things that make you go vroom. On the face of this, you may think it would be rather important for players to keep a careful eye on their resources and to be sure and maintain control of resources for their empire. No, not really. Chances are the average player is going to be waiting on an acquisition timer before they wait to gain more of a particular resource. You can go into the maps and see a lovely spread of these resources if you want. It shows you what type of resource a hex produces and how much of it. It theoretically should all be very useful information. However, this is what most players will say when they see this screen. Again, resources simply just do not typically have that much impact on a player unless you are in a situation where your faction controls no territories and you are broke. But more on that later. So, that's enough prefacing. Now on to the idea. What I propose is creating a cache of resources, a stockpile, at every major base and every warp gate. When accessing the resource screen, you would have the option to view the current continent's stockpiles on one screen, to the effect of something like this. Here you can see an easy-to-read representation of all the current stockpiles in the form of pie charts. The colors represent the various resource types, and the fuller the slice, the more of that resource is currently stored at that particular stockpile. At the top, you have warp gates, which are a primary stockpile of sorts. The left column are all tech plants, the center column all biolabs, and the final column all amp stations. This is further divided into rows, with the topmost row representing the bases traditionally considered to be Vanu sovereignty turf, the middle row being the bases typically in the Crimson Hands of Elmo, and the bottom row, of course, being the typical bases of the Smurf Brigade. When viewing this screen in-game, it would look something more akin to this, each base highlighted according to which faction it currently belongs to. So you can readily see here that the VS have taken a TR Biolab, and down to the bottom right you can see that Zervin has been grayed out. We will revisit why this is a bit later. Now that you understand the layout, the basic concept behind these stockpiles is that when the faction gains resources, they aren't immediately doled out to players. Instead, the resources are first virtually processed by a specific base type. Tech plants process mechanized resources, which seems fitting as they are the base required for main battle tanks. Amp stations process aerospace resources, perhaps acting as fuel refineries. Biolabs process infantry resources as they focus on technologies made for the individual. What this means is that you must have at least one base of each type, or the other bases, excluding the warp gates, which again are a sort of primary stockpile, will not stockpile a particular resource. So put another way, if you lose your amp station, then your tech plant and your biolab will no longer be able to stockpile aerospace. The warp gate, however, will still receive them. Also, it is important not just to keep possession of a base, but to also keep a hex link running from it and the warp gate. This is the supply line. If this is broken, then the affected facility is likewise not going to be able to process resources. Another thing to think about is what happens to your forces when you're behind enemy lines. Take this squad here, represented by this green triangle. This squad wants to head north into Elmo territory. Once they do so, however, they will no longer be able to receive resources during the normal resource uptick cycle. Once they fully capture an enemy hex, however, they will once again be able to receive resources as normal. This makes it a little easier on defenders because the attacker will be affected by attrition. An attacking force will find it increasingly difficult to field equipment and vehicles the longer they remain behind enemy lines, somewhat blunting the effect of an aimless Zerg force sweeping across the continent, taking many territories in rapid fashion. As they take losses, it will become difficult for them to sustain the Zerg rush. Speaking of the Zerg, one likely criticism is that they simply aren't going to pay attention to resource management because they are focused on simply moving forward and engaging in battle. So let's take a look at Johnny Zerg here in his Mag Rider. I want information about resources to both be relevant to everyone involved and also to be easily accessible and understood literally at a glance. So, what you might notice here is that I've included a new HUD element, shown here in the bottom right. This is simply a non-intrusive graph showing which base the player is currently being resupplied from, and approximately how much of each resource it has remaining. So that means every player has at least some awareness as to what the current economic situation is. Which brings me to my next point. I haven't exactly covered how players actually receive these glorious, now important resources. So here's what happens. A player buys something at a terminal, such as this shiny scythe. The cost is deducted from the player's current personal pool of resources, just as it does now. Note that the player never spends resources directly out of a stockpile. Now having a lighter wallet, the player later receives more resources during the next uptick. It is these upticks that in turn are taken out of the stockpile nearest to the player. So, assuming that every player is pinching their pennies and have their personal pools capped, and nothing is being pulled out of the stockpiles. Which reminds me, what happens when a stockpile is full of a particular resource? Well, as surplus resources roll into a particular base, they are automatically rolled over to the warp gate. The warp gates in turn supply the other stockpiles if they have a surplus. They can also supply other warp gates, but more on that later. So, now that you have an understanding of how the resources generally flow, I'm going to provide a couple examples as to what this means for the bigger picture. Let's look into what happens when you cut off a base from this supply line. Here you can see the VS doing what they do best, being triumphant against all those that ignorantly defy them. More specifically, Zervan has been cut off from the warp gate. Its supply line has been severed, and it is now
under siege.
Story: Steven Seagal. So, what is going on here when the base is under siege? The stockpile no longer accumulates or transfers resources. So, with Zervan being an amp station, this means that any other base the NC owns, other than the warp gate, are no longer accumulating aerospace resources. Left unchecked, this will gradually have a stifling effect on their ability to field air support. Now, going back to the stockpile screen, Zervan is grayed out here as it has been cut off from any supply line. Also, even though control of the base has not fully flipped, the defenders inside are treated as though they are behind enemy lines. The attackers as well are suffering from attrition until they can finalize capture of the hex. This can make it quite a tense situation for both factions involved. as they push to either take or maintain control of a base before attrition really starts to kick in. All of this attrition makes Steven Seagal cry. And that's just no pretty sight, and if the new conglomerate has any self-respect, they'll take some hexes to re-establish the supply line to Zervan, which, as you can see, makes Steven Seagal happy. Now, back to what I was saying earlier about Warpgate surplus and other continents. What was I getting at there? Well, let's take a look at another example as to how resource management builds a better metagame. How many Elmos and Smurfs in the audience have seen something like this at some point, where the righteous technology of the Vanu sovereignty has wiped you off the face of the continent? Practically all of you. It really is a decidedly melancholy position to be in, as now all you really have is your warp gate, and like the TR up here, you aren't really making any sort of appreciable income. This makes it very difficult to make a successful push out of the warp gate to reclaim territory. So what of it? Well, let's flip over to Amrish, where the sovereignty has decided that the woods and mountains are too rustic for our contemporary designs and have left it to the TR to wallow in. Well, since they are obviously going to be earning a lot of surplus here, it is going to start being transferred to other warp gates, meaning that if you are doing good on one continent, it can help fuel your efforts on another, even if you lack territories. There you have it, lads and lasses. Cross-continental metagame. So, all this being said, there are definitely some things that need to be figured out here, loose ends to be tied, itches to be scratched. First and foremost, we need to make sure that any and all precautions are taken to prevent players from unfairly exploiting or cheesing this system and ruining it for everyone else. Secondly, I've used Indar in most of my examples here. Not every continent is built like Indar, and the resource system would need to be custom tailored a bit to fit each continent like a warm, fuzzy sock. Which means, thirdly, a lot of experimentation would need to be done to really figure out the numbers of it all and be sure that everything is working in a way that is balanced and sensible. Lastly, a really good design ethic needs to be applied that makes all of the information I've gone over presentable to players in such a way that they get all the information they need within seconds to minutes without bogging things down or confusing them. Now, to really recap what I find so very attractive about this idea, it integrates something already currently in the game and uses it to expand the metagame. And it makes resources actually count for something. Also, it can create a cross-continent metagame without requiring continent locks. And it also creates a solid foundation that can be built and expanded upon down the road. Which brings us to the future. In the future, this system could be expanded in a few different zany ways. We could have a Sunder certification that allows them to manually transfer resources. This would allow players and outfits to more directly transfer resources where they need to go in order to fuel pushes and various outfit operations. We could also possibly have bandit Sunders that could sneak into unguarded enemy stockpiles and steal resources away. Or we could have entirely new vehicles with all sorts of interesting new play dynamics for supply convoys. Those are just a couple ideas I've thought of, but there are dozens of possibilities. In the meantime, I'd really love to see resources have a more important role in the game, and I hope that even if this idea doesn't catch on, it stirs up more conversation on the subject. My gratitude goes to you, for without the you in YouTube, we would only have Tube. So thank you for watching this in its entirety. If you found this idea generally palatable, please help it take root and grow into a wondrous tree that bears many strange, glowing fruits of enlightenment by liking it and upvoting the Reddit thread. If you have something you'd like to discuss or contribute, I'd love to caress your every last word. And if that last sentence didn't weird you out, please comment on previously mentioned thread.